Welcome to the Hope After Narcissistic Abuse podcast. I am your host, Amy Helms. Each week, you will hear from experts across the country and even world speak to you on recovering from narcissistic abuse and even how to manage these relationships. You will also hear some periodic solo episodes on how to manage these relationships and what recovery is like. It is my hope that you will leave each episode with some renewed hope that you can and will beat this. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome to the second episode of our podcast, Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. Today, I'm excited to have Brenda Stephens on our show. Brenda is a licensed therapist and has a group practice in California. She is the author of a couple of well-known books. They're going to be linked in the show notes. Recovering from Narcissistic Mother's Daughter's Guide, as well as the Narcissism Recovery Workbook, Skills for Healing from Emotional Abuse. And you can read more about Brenda in the show notes as well. So welcome, Brenda. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I'll just kind of get right to it. What does it mean just to be a narcissist in your terms?
Well, that's a really good question because I think this term is thrown around a little too loosely these days. Anyone who has some selfish tendencies seems to get a label of being a narcissist, and that is absolutely not accurate as far as like diagnosing goes, and maybe even not accurate as far as really toxic relationships go too. We all tend to have some selfish behaviors and they tend to be worse from time to time. But a narcissist certainly to meet narcissistic personality disorder criteria, there's 9 items and 5 of those have to be met to get a diagnosis. And
we also know they're not going to just walk into a doctor's office and say, hey, I think I have this. Can you diagnose me?
Exactly. That probably rarely happens, which is, I think, well, that's a whole other topic, why the numbers are pretty low. And I think that's part of the reason why. But yeah, I mean, I think the biggest, if I had to pick one thing that really describes the difference between somebody being really selfish and someone being a narcissist, is the low level of empathy. That is the one of the key qualifiers and signifiers, if that's a word, of someone having some narcissistic traits that are pretty serious.
So how would this show up in a relationship or in someone?
The lack of empathy or in general?
The lack of empathy, how could we know that?
So I think this is actually something that could even be seen in the beginning stages of the relationship if we're able to pay attention to that, which is a big if, because typically in the beginning in a romantic relationship, in the beginning, we're not looking at these things as much as we're looking at kind of the love bombing that goes on in romantic relationships. But with the lack of empathy, you will see some signs, like even in the dating period, and I'm being very precise, I think, in this example, but hopefully people can generalize this. But say you go out on a date with a narcissist and you're ordering dinner and the narcissist, your date is rude, let's say, to the waiter for no reason, or the server, I should say. And these are signs to kind of pay attention to in the beginning, because that rudeness or the high expectation or the lack of understanding if the server makes a mistake. I mean, these are all signs that we can probably see pretty early on in the relationship, but we might dismiss if we don't know to look for them. But moving on a little bit further, I mean, you will see lots of signs of lack of empathy, and eventually those signs will be turned onto you as the romantic partner or the child of or the friend of the narcissist. There will be little empathy for you. And even if there is some moment of you're sick and your narcissist decides to take you to the hospital, there may be a little bit of empathy there, but then what you'll see is how much you inconvenienced them. Even just being sick home on the couch, it's an inconvenience to them. They will not have the empathy for you. They will have, if anything, the empathy for themselves, because they'll feel bad that they're not being taken care of properly.
I have to laugh at your examples. My ex-husband got mad that I was being too loud when I was giving birth.
Oh my gosh. That's a really good example.
and and then at one point I had my gallbladder out, and he signed that little piece of paper saying I will not leave, and then went and got a haircut. And so I was out of surgery, and they were ready to dismiss me. And I was apologizing to the nurses for him not being there. But looking back, I'm like, that was lack of empathy.
Oh, yes,
But
most definitely.
I think those little subtle things do show up. But I think it's so important in the beginning to be able to recognize those little things. How are they treating other people?
Yes.
Are they, when they're checking out, if they're actually going grocery shopping, how are they treating that person? How are they treating their coworkers, everyone?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And those signs are there. We just haven't learned to look for them yet early on in these relationships.
We talk about this occurring on a spectrum.
Yes.
Narcissist is thrown out a lot, especially in politics, social media.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's a narcissist. I break up, I'm getting mad at this person, they're a narcissist.
Yes.
How do you see this on a spectrum? Because there's even healthy narcissism.
There is healthy narcissism. I remember when I was in grad school, one of my professors telling us we were all sort of narcissistic because we thought we could get into grad school in the first place. So if there's healthy narcissism, that might have been the first example of it pointed out to me in my life. But definitely there is. I mean, I think a degree of healthy narcissism can maybe push us into doing things that are outside of our comfort zone. And just having kind of the confidence that it'll turn out okay because we've maybe had successes in the past. Those are healthy examples. The spectrum piece definitely is important. I have seen, I work with survivors of narcissistic abuse, so I get their version of what's happened. But I will tell you, the stories are all so similar. And I mean, the whole reason I even got into this in the first place is because so many women, and it was mostly women, were coming in to see me and describing these relationships. And I started to think they were all dating my ex because they were describing the same kind of pattern in the relationship that I experienced, and then one thing led to the other. But also with seeing these relationships, and even in my own, with mine, we met when we were very young, and I've seen that narcissism actually get worse and worse and worse over 30 years. I've also seen in the folks that I work with different levels of how their narcissist shows up in their relationships. I always use this one client of mine as a shining example of this because her narcissist is her husband. And actually her story's in my first book. The first book. And I think I've never met him, but I think he's much lower on the spectrum because when their marriage fell apart and when they separated, it was really a wake-up call for him. And I don't want to give false hope to anybody. I mean, I think this is a rare thing that happened, but I think because he was lower on the spectrum of narcissism, he was able to do some self-reflection. He was willing to go to a therapist that is in Washington State who specializes in this with narcissistic couples, which is a really, really specialized niche. And they've grown from that. But they work every day on this relationship, and they notice each other's triggers. And when it's time to kind of go back into therapy, well, they're actually full-time back into therapy now, but they've actually realized how important that is to kind of stay on top of this all the time because those old habits creep in even with someone low on the spectrum. But I like to talk about this story because it gives me hope too that not every narcissistic relationship is doomed to, end up in brimstone and fire. It's rarely that those relationships survive, and this one is a shining example of someone low on the spectrum that can actually heal themselves in order to show up better in a relationship.
So then as it moves up the spectrum, you mentioned the past 30 years, what do you think that's changing?
So, I mean, I've had the privilege or I don't know if that's a privilege. I've had the opportunity, let's say, to watch this develop because, like I said, we were very young and he was a much different person. Although looking back in my own relationship, I can definitely see it. But over the years, I think there's just been more cynicism, more hate, more prejudice, all of these things that have just increased in his personality and their skill, right? Their skill it's a terrible skill, but their skill in manipulation, which is what all narcissists do. So over these years that I've known this man, he has gotten better and better and better at manipulating people. And putting on his mask, his narcissistic mask, showing people what he thinks they want to see so that he has this image of himself reflected back to him the way he wants to see it by just basically lying about who he is. And I've definitely seen that increase quite a bit over the years. He's just gotten better at it.
I guess with social media, with technology, it can make it worse with like the mind games.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, I walked into that 30-day hearing with my ex, and he had my 9 years of my life backed up onto a hard drive and in files. And it was emails, pictures. They were all edited to show the bad part, but it was just mind blowing that that kind of technology could be used. And 30 years ago, that wouldn't have been a thing.
Right. So true.
We didn't have computers. But that does make sense.
Yeah. And social media I get that question a lot too about social media. And, is social media creating more narcissists? And I actually don't think that that's the case. I think it's just a platform, like you said, that wasn't available 30 years ago that is available now. And it's perfect for people who have narcissistic traits. But I don't think it's creating narcissism, because that typically comes from a whole other place.
That leads to a great question. What do you think creates? Is it the nature or nurture combination?
I think it's both. Like probably everybody answers that question by saying it's probably both. I do think for narcissism specifically, I do think it probably weighs a little heavier on the nature side. On the nurture side. I said that wrong. There is some research coming out now that is showing that there may be a genetic link to this personality disorder, but the research has a lot of growing to do, a long way to go. And then what we know currently is narcissism typically comes by one of two paths. One is typically neglect and abuse in childhood, and the other is overindulgence in childhood, which are two totally polar opposite things that lead to the same result, basically. A child that grows up not having a sense of self, lashing out at everybody, relying on that reflection that they get back from other people to show them what they want to see. And really, they grow up without having a sense of who they are. So if somebody's reflecting, which is what they look for, they want people reflecting back positive views. So they're impressive, and narcissists honestly tend to be pretty smart for the most part. So they tend to be successful, and they can get a lot of praise because of that, or they can do things that are helpful in the community, but they don't do it because of, their altruism. They do it because of what gets reflected back to them. So I think I went off on a tangent there. I'm sorry, but I do think it's nurture more, because we've seen that. I mean, there's research that shows that these personality disorders develop mostly out of abuse and neglect.
And I see a lot of the overindulgence too, at least some personal experience of clients I work with, that a lot of, at the drop of the hat, they would call a mom over calling the spouse or the partner, or, to form of anything. That's the first person they call, because they'll get the coddling.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Coddling's so important. So you mentioned the success. They tend to also, form relationships with successful women, right?
Yes, they do. That is such a good point. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I don't know about you, but the work that I do, it's mostly with women, and that's simply because women come to therapy more than men do at this point, unfortunately. So that's my I guess test circle is pretty biased. But I have a lot of women come to me and often are like disappointed in themselves. I guess that's the best way I can say it. How did they get duped? How did they get so fooled? Why didn't they see this sooner? All of these things, and really get down on themselves, even though they have all of this evidence of doing things so successfully in their lives. And it's really very crushing, I think, for folks who are doing well and then have this thing that's happened to them, this relationship that can be pretty destructive to your whole being. It's really quite a dynamic for them to be involved in. And most of these folks, men and women that I work with, tend to be very successful. And I don't mean necessarily even just making a lot of money, that kind of thing, but tend to have big hearts, tend to have a lot of creativity. The narcissist is definitely trying to align themselves with people who have something to offer. And that leads.
It's another way to boost that image.
Exactly. It's a good reflection on them.
Or one that, despite the big image, they can bring down to make them look good.
Exactly. Yeah, which is really sad.
So you mentioned that, and I see this too, when women are questioning, why did I get into this? I should know better. What do you suggest for someone that's dealing with that shame and that self-disappointment?
Oh gosh, your questions are awesome.
That's a whole therapy question, but
It is. And really, we touched on this earlier. You and I did. Just the validation, right? The validation that what they went through was certainly not anything they deserved, certainly something they could not have seen coming, because not many people understand what it's like to be around a narcissist full time, right? You might come across them here and there, but to start a life with a narcissist, or even being raised by a narcissist, you don't know any different, right? And I am going to go out on a limb here, just speak from my own experience, that in therapy, I often have people come because they're in a romantic relationship with a narcissist. And as they start to explore and understand that, they realize that there were other people in their lives that were narcissists too. And oftentimes that's a parent or a caregiver or even a grandparent. But we tend to see this kind of be a generational thing. Not that everyone turns into a narcissist, but that there are effects of it all over the place generationally, And we know psychologically too that we tend to be attracted to what's familiar. So if we were raised by a narcissist, or we had a favorite relative that was a narcissist, when we meet somebody who's got narcissistic traits, it's going to feel familiar and comfortable, and we'll be drawn to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then also that love bombing you mentioned occurs in the beginning. We don't see it in the beginning. Right. And then it's almost too late to get out by the time we see it. I was raised by like the epitome of a perfect marriage. They're about to celebrate their 50th.
Wow.
And I was the first person I knew to get divorced, like literally knew. And so, doing what's familiar, it almost led to some of that shame, because how did I end up like this? How am I the only one at family gatherings? It's a single parent. But it was that love bombing in the beginning. It was, wow, I'm almost lucky to have this person until I wasn't.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think a lot of folks that I work with have so much shame around that, and that love bombing. And, I also think people, they look at love bombing and they think, it's presents and flowers and, trips. And that's not it necessarily. That is it sometimes. But a lot of times it's like kind of weaseling their way into all of your nooks and crannies. And really, they do a study on you. You may not realize it, but when you tell them what your favorite flower and your favorite color and your favorite food is, they're going to bring that into conversation as they're getting to know you. They're going to take note of all of these things. And what you, as a person who is interested in this relationship, is going to hear is, oh, they really see me and they really hear me. And we're building a connection. So we just, of course, what's what we all want. It's just the motivation for a narcissist to do it is much different. And those little things are love bombing too. So I've had a lot of people say to me, I was never loved bombed, but I don't think that I think that they may have a picture of what love bombing is, when it's really can be very subtle and kind of devious.
And it can even be those, just sitting on the couch and asking you a question or paying attention. So I didn't get gifts or presents in the beginning. It was more someone paying attention to me. And I think he knew that I didn't have a whole lot of dating experience. And I think that was his way in to manipulating me, is being the first kind of person to really pay attention. So I think you're right about what love bombing is. It has a lot of, misinformation out there.
Yeah. There's a lot of different flavors to love bombing for sure.
So kind of related, but trauma bonding, how does that relate to narcissism?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, in a nutshell, super easy answer to that, or not easy, but simple. A simple answer to that is that so for all of us, narcissist or not, when we have a rupture in a relationship and then we rebuild that relationship or repair that relationship, it strengthens the relationship, right? So in narcissistic abuse, you have this cycle of abuse. So you've got so let's just say you've got the rupture, the repair, the calm period, and then it starts building up again, another rupture, repair, calm period. Those ruptures and repairs can build the trauma bond, right? It's definitely manipulative on the narcissist part. I don't know that they like consciously say, okay, this is the cycle, this is the phase of the cycle that we're in. I don't think that's the case, but it works both ways, right? So the narcissist wins you over a little bit more when you're in that repair phase of that cycle. And I think that's where the trauma bonding comes in, because you've gone through, kind of walked through the fire, come out the other side, repaired the relationship, I say in air quotes, because he or she, the narcissist, did not repair. You feel like there was a repair, and then you move through the cycle again.
Right. In somatic experiencing, in the training, they play this great video of like rupture repair and how to avoid shame of a bear pulling its cub in when it sees a predator and immediately after embracing the little cub, and how that's like a true rupture and repair. And, but that's not what we see with the trauma bonding. It's kind of a fake apology.
Exactly. That's exactly true. Yeah.
So recovery is also a process and on a spectrum. I know you work a lot with women with this abuse.
Yes.
And it's a process. So I think it can be frustrating too. And another reason successful, smart women can think, I should be moving further along. Why am I not further along? And what can people expect once they start toward recovery?
So I think this is not what people want to hear. It does take a long time, right? Because I really am starting to see this. And I think I'm in one of my books, I think the second book, I talk about this a little bit more. There is a process to this. And one huge hurdle in that process is, well, two, I should say, but they're related. The radical acceptance of the fact that that person was never, ever who you thought they were. It is so hard for us to wrap our heads around that. And there's some cognitive dissonance that goes along with that too. But it's so hard for us to let go or grieve over a relationship with somebody who never existed. So the grief is super complex, but the grief is also, it has to happen, right? I mean, it just does happen. So the radical acceptance of what it actually was, and not like trying to bargain and if only I had done this better or hadn't argued about this, then he wouldn't be that way. No, the narcissist will be the way they're going to be always.
Allowing that grief. I think sometimes we see, well, why am I sad when this was not a nice person?
Yes, this is typically a big hurdle. Like I said, moving past the grief is very complicated. And a client who's in therapy for this wants to feel better, right? And honestly, going through the grief piece of this recovery can feel like a step backwards when really it's a giant leap forward, because you're, again, with grief, you're accepting what is. It's a big step to get to and to go through, but once you get on the other side of that grief, oh my gosh, things change and you get to kind of some indifference, like not ruminating and not what ifing. I think I see a lot of what ifing. What if I had done this differently? What if I had done that differently? When you go through the grief process, you give up on that and you spend a lot less time ruminating on the relationship as a whole.
Mm-hmm. You open up so much more room for other things, which is beautiful.
It really is. But nobody wants to feel, I mean, of course we don't, right? Nobody wants to feel grief.
Mm-hmm. It's painful and it's confusing.
Very, yeah.
And I know you mentioned this in your book, and it's the Narcissism Recovery Workbook, and it's linked in the show notes. You talk about the importance of self-care, but without going too much into it. Can you share just a little bit about the importance of self-care?
Oh my gosh, yes. And this is so incredibly important, especially because if you have been in a relationship with a narcissist, no matter who the narcissist is, you have been ignoring yourself. I promise you, bottom line, that's what's going on. And I think too, like I talk about this a lot, like self-care is certainly a trendy term these days. And I think a lot of times people will think of it as like, I need to go have a spa day. And that's absolutely not, I mean, sure, do it if you can, but that's not what I'm talking about when I say self-care. What I'm saying is don't call yourself stupid. Maybe go look in the mirror and say, I love you. Practice saying the word no. for boundaries. These are all like just little tiny things that you can do every day that are self-care. Because like I said, I promise you've been ignoring yourself. You have not been taking care of your own needs. That person has come first, or keeping the peace in the family has come first, and you have been ignored. And as you mentioned too, like people coming into therapy and thinking that they've been foolish, and how could they have let this happen, comes with a lot of self-defeating self-talk. And that is to me like the first step here is changing that self-talk. So you talk to yourself with love instead of condemnation or criticism. Talking to yourself with love is it's such a shift. And it's a very powerful self-care thing to do.
Yeah, and recognizing when that's happening, when telling a narrative, well, I did this and then this happened. Well, no, you didn't do it. This happened.
Exactly. Yes, so true. Yeah.
I know for me, the first thing I did, so I got divorced and moved out of state, and I started taking tennis lessons again because I had given stuff like that up. And so it was like, what could I not do? Or what was I told not to do? What was in the way? And I just started doing everything.
Yes.
And it was so freeing. I wasn't going to be the best, but I didn't care. It was my way of self-care, and it was so fun.
And this is essential too. And I feel like this is the most fun part of the recovery process is learning who you are again. Because as I said, you haven't been paying attention to yourself. We lose like, what are we interested in? What are we passionate about? And what do we even like? What's my favorite food? What's my favorite movie? I mean, all of those things kind of just get thrown to the wayside, especially the longer these relationships go on. So you're talking about the fun part of the recovery is just rediscovering yourself, which is a beautiful piece of this process.
And like when you were asking those questions, being able to find out if you can even answer that.
Mm-hmm.
What food do I like? Because you probably haven't had a choice in that. Or what restaurant do I like? There may be a place you never want to go to again that was your frequent place.
Yeah. Yeah.
So rediscovering those things.
Yep, exactly. It is a process of rediscovery or first-time discovery. I mean, some people went from a childhood being raised by narcissists into a narcissistic relationship and have no idea who they are when they're 40 years old and they're getting away from all of this. So, but that I hope is encouraging to folks because there is a fun part of this recovery process. Unfortunately, we don't get there until we kind of walk through the grief, but the rediscovery is fantastic.
I think I can confidently say that the pain with that grief is nothing as bad as being in the relationship.
That's a very good point.
And sometimes it's hard to see when you're in it, but I think you see it after the fact, kind of like that hindsight that we see everything.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Is there anything else you think is important for our listeners to take home or realize? Any kind of final points?
How would I narrow it down? I just really, really want people to believe from the bottom of their hearts that they can recover from this. Like you said, I mean, it's a process. Going through the grief is very difficult, but the grief is nothing compared to the relationship itself. And I think that's really an important thing for folks to just keep in mind. It may feel terrible, but at least you're on your way out when you're in the grief process, and hopefully that's reassuring to folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you. And I've linked your information in the show notes, but do you want to let the viewers know or listeners know where to find you online?
Absolutely. So we have a website. It's Narcissistic Abuse Recovery Trauma. And the website is www.narctrauma.com. And my email is hello@narctrauma.com. We offer groups too. And we do support groups every week for people who are in any phase of their relationship with a narcissist. So everyone is welcome. We're always admitting new folks into our group. So please let your listeners know they are more than welcome to join us if they like.
Great. And is there a cost for that? How do people join?
So they can go to the website, thenarctrauma.com, and there's a link, and it's $20 per group. And we do them every Thursday, and we alternate the times, early, an afternoon and an evening every other week. 1 week it's afternoon, one afternoon it's evening. 1 week it's evening. Wait.
It's such a great service to offer to people. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being on here.
My pleasure.
I'm sure you've been such a help to everyone listening.
Oh, I hope so. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you again for tuning in to our podcast, Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. We hope you were able to leave with some renewed hope. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe to the channel, give us a review, head to the show notes for more information on the things that we highlighted. And there's also a link to the website for a course that we offer on the same topic, Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. Thank you again, and please tune in to the next episode.